Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me better than I've been hearing you. The connection has not been so great. So, in that hope, Namaskar, good morning. Lord Krishna tells us in the Gita that what is night for all beings is for the wise. We are experiencing this right now. It is nighttime for me here in Canada. And by the way, also still Monday and Louis Riel Day, when we honor that great Métis leader. But for you, the wise in Bengal, it is daytime. And I'm so honored to be invited into this wise gathering. I'm speaking to you from the city of Winnipeg in the Canadian province of Manitoba. These, of course, are Indigenous names. Manitoba, I've heard different etymologies, but certainly something about God or a spirit of this land. Winnipeg more prosaically means dirty water from the murky brown color of the rivers and lakes in this area. Winnipeg is on Indigenous land, as is all of what we call Canada, but specifically Métis Nation. I won't say the traditional territories, because this is very much a present day matter. And the fact that I know whose land I live on and that it matters to me as a person of European descent, that is the result of Indigenous voices speaking out. Voices from here are. I believe you were disconnected. Let me know when I should resume.
Yes, you are audible, Justin.
But it told me a moment ago that the conference had left the meeting. So I stopped. If the conference is back in the meeting, I'll begin from where I left off. So voices from here, where I am, are prominent in this conference. I see the Cree author Thompson Highway from northern Manitoba as the subject of a paper. I see two papers in the program on Katharina Vermette, a Métis author from this city, and Kalumpa Bob and Tanya Carter's piercing and eloquent talk mentioned Elijah Harper of blessed memory, who was a powerful Indigenous voice in Manitoba's legislature. I am not Indigenous to this land, nor am I an expert on Canadian literature, as many of you are. What then can I add? Only, I think, my own perspective as a Jewish Winnipegger who loves stories. As such, I could easily tell you about Winnipeg without mentioning Indigenous people. Not so long ago, that would have been normal. I would tell you that Winnipeg is a mid-sized Canadian city, population 7.5 lakh, in the middle of the North American continent, at the forks of the Red River and the Assiniboine River, on the eastern edge of the Great Prairie. It is a city with terribly cold winters, with summers plagued by mosquitoes, and with more than its fair share of social problems, violence, homelessness, addiction, but with a distinct identity, a sense of civic pride mixed with self-deprecation, and a thriving cultural and artistic life. It is a multicultural city in which the population is also a historic center of Canadian Jewish life. The Jews here are mostly descendants of refugees from the Tsarist Empire who made their way here in the late 1800s and early 1900s. A few generations, Montreal and Toronto, Canada's biggest city, community was active and proud. There were many synagogues, many businesses serving the needs of the Jewish population, such as kosher butcher shops, many Jewish schools representing different religious and ideological stands. Yiddish, the traditional vernacular of Eastern European Jewry, was widely spoken here into the 1960s. In more recent decades, as discrimination has declined and many Jews have succeeded in businesses and professions, the community has diminished precipitously in size and in cultural dynamism. The kosher butchers are all gone. Only a half dozen synagogues hold regular Sabbath services, and there is one consolidated Jewish school. Rarely does one hear a conversation in Yiddish. But the Jewish community, today numbering at most 15,000, is well organized, fairly unified, holds frequent cultural festivals, and provides social services to its needy members. If I were telling you about Winnipeg in this, let me give you a random sample. Lynn Cook, in her biography of local musician Donna Gresco, The Little Magic Fiddler, published in 1951, has the young heroist to Northern Cree Indians a long time ago. Bess Kaplan's novel of Jewish life in Winnipeg, Malka, Malka, published in 1977, has her elderly heroine riding a streetcar through a seedy part of downtown, past the beer parlor hotels where Indians leaned against the buildings. Original population relocated to the rooftops of the city, an Aboriginal happy land in the sky. So, Indigenous people are of the distant past, or of the disreputable part of the present, or a fantasy on the edges of consciousness. But all this has surely no thoughtful person could tell you about Winnipeg today without respectful attention to the Indigenous people here. All Wolverine washed his face at Hudson Bay, explains why salty, dirty water, why Winnipeg so named. Myths are sacred stories, but that should never blind us to their humor. There is also, I believe, a new mythology being created today. As a notice to this, but I do a statue of Queen Victoria stood in front of the Manitoba Legislative Building. One summer's day, while the statue was still there, I happened to be sitting in a circle of Indigenous saying, that to Canada through the northern door, to Canada through the northern door, with her merry men. That stories of their ways told often quietly as of the abuse they lived through there. Many of them could only tell these stories in English. Their ancestral languages had been stripped from them by that source of children on the grounds of some of these schools has allowed many of us to think of the oppression of Indigenous people as a thing of the past, since after all, those schools are no more. But Those of us who have continued to them adopted into non-Indigenous families. This is referred to now as the 60s scoop, though it did not end in the 60s. And they are being taken away today by our so-called family and child services and our so-called justice system. And so we become aware that Winnipeg is a colonial city. It is not just that Winnipeg, much like Kolkata, came into existence as a city through British mercantile imperialism, nor is it just that the Winnipeg area, after joining the Dominion of Canada in 1870 as a predominantly Métis community, was overrun by Anglo-Canadian settlers who took control of the city for generations. It is also that the city itself, over time, became a colonizing power. Winnipeg has taken over what were distinct communities nearby, notably Saint Boniface, a French-speaking town whose francophone character has of course diminished since it was amalgamated into English-dominated Winnipeg. Winnipeg steals its drinking water from Shoal Lake, 155 kilometers to the east, where the building of the aqueduct in 1919 cut off an Anishinaabe community from safe drinking water for itself for over 100 years. Winnipeg takes its electricity from giant hydroelectric dams in the north of Manitoba that have wreaked havoc on the land and on the Cree and Métis communities there. When the Red River rises, a channel protects the city from flooding by diverting the water to nearby First Nations. In 2011, a whole Anishinaabe community, Lake St. Martin First Nation, was flooded out. As of today, about a third of the community, 1,000 people, have not yet returned home because housing is not available. Most are in Winnipeg, where some are homeless, some have succumbed to addiction, and several are among the many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this genocidal country. And yet all this can seem like a nightmare from which we are awakening, because there is so much change in the air. Winnipeg's Indigenous population having technical difficulties of my own here. Winnipeg's Indigenous population is now over 1 lakh, at least 15% of the city, and steadily growing. We recently had our first Métis mayor, Brian Bowman, from 2014 to 2022. Central Winnipeg, where I live, has been represented in Canada's Parliament by Robert Falcon Ouellette, who is Plains Cree, from 2015 to 2019, and since then by Leah Gazan, who is Lakota. The city continually looks more Indigenous. I walk along one of the major set is there in the sky, as it were, painted at rooftop level on a storefront. The river is the reason we are all here. She carried us on her broad brown back without complaint. Downtown, the iconic Hudson's Bay Company department store has been given to First Nations and is being redeveloped as an Indigenous center. Across the street from there, a new indoor skateboarding park proudly displays the Cree name, Pitikwe, meaning murals in the distinctive visual languages of Anishinaabe and Métis art appear on more and more public buildings. Large billboards remind us that the Red River Métis Nation has its own recognized and today rather prosperous self-government in the Manitoba Métis Federation. Last fall, we elected Manitoba's first First Nations Premier, Wab Kinew, who is Anishinaabe and leads a very diverse group of members of the Legislative Assembly. It is a time of hope. Yet the hope exists along harsh realities. Recently, I attended the world premiere of Liqueur, an opera telling stories of the Métis people. With a large Indigenous cast, the opera was sung in French, English, and three Indigenous languages, Anishinaabe and two Michif Métis languages. The opera, the story it tells, and the very fact of its performance tell a story of hope. But leaving the opera, we went to wait for a city bus. Many of our bus stops have bus shelters to protect waiting passengers from our harsh weather. But for the last several winters, these bus shelters have become places that unhoused, mostly Indigenous people sleep and live in. Actual passengers waiting for buses feel they have no safe place to wait in the winter cold. In response, the city has taken down the sides of some of these bus shelters, so they now serve no purpose to anyone. The story they tell is one of despair. I didn't grow up in Winnipeg, but I will speak now as a member of Winnipeg's Jewish community, which I am part of. Where are we in all this? Let me begin by reflecting on the word settler, which we increasingly find ourselves called. Part of the vitality of Indigenous language today, colonial language, to the North America. Of all the new words being created, maybe the most contentious is settler, as the label for non-Indigenous Canadians, especially white people. I'm not sure if this usage actually comes from Indigenous creativity or from white activist guilt. Not all Indigenous thinkers favor it. At least two of my Indigenous colleagues at the University of Manitoba have critiqued this term settler. Nigan Sinclair, who is Anishinaabe, critiques it because it can be used to other people rather than building relationships. Emma LaRocque, who is Cree Métis, critiques the term because it implies that the land was not settled already by Indigenous people themselves. But surely the intended force of calling white Canadians settlers is to acknowledge settler colonialism and the fact that we are beneficiaries of it. And that awareness certainly comes from Indigenous activism. I will go out on a limb and say that settlers aren't all bad. The fathers of the Métis Nation were French and British descended fur traders, Anishinaabe, and Cree women. Without them, there would not be the proud Métis Nation of today. But in practice, settler often has a sinister ring. And I think for Jews, this is particularly uncomfortable because we've heard it used that way and may have used it that way ourselves about the Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Many of us see those settlers on Palestinian land outside the recognized borders of the State of Israel as undermining all hope for peace. And those of us who are politically supportive of those settlers are still aware that they are seen very negatively by much of the world. So it is disorienting to see that same term, settlers, applied to us here. And we Jews have really never thought of ourselves as settlers here. That term was generally used in the past for only the earliest European arrivals. Here in Winnipeg, it referred quite specifically to the Selkirk settlers, economic refugees from Scotland who were granted land along the rivers by the Anishinaabe in the early 1800s. The Jewish community was established later, when Winnipeg was already thoroughly settled. We were refugees escaping poverty and persecution. We didn't create the colonial structure that was already in place. And we never fully fit into that structure. We were separated from all other early immigrant groups, not only by ethnicity and language, but by religion. Whatever their differences, they all believed in Jesus Christ. We did not. Largely for that reason, we were excluded in many ways from colonial Manitoban society. Elderly Winnipeg Jews today who grew up in the city's impoverished North End still remember taunting and beatings from their equally poor but Christian immigrant neighbors. The upper classes, English Winnipeggers, discriminated against us openly. The University of Manitoba Medical School limited the number of Jewish students it would accept. The entire neighborhood, called Tuxedo, had a covenant barring Jews from living there. Yet that institutionalized discrimination ended decades ago, and anti-Jewish prejudice has diminished. I myself have only been called a fucking Jew by a random stranger once in my 15 years in Winnipeg. Unpleasant, but not to be compared with what Indigenous people and people of color go through. By and large, Jews in Winnipeg have prospered and become accepted. Just before our recent Métis mayor, we had our first Jewish mayor, Sam Cates, elected in 2004 and twice thereafter. If settler is shorthand for beneficiary of settler colonialism, we are that. And as Jewish Canadian historian David Kaufman and others have pointed out, we may have been innocent of why we were brought into this country, but we were not brought in innocently. Like the Ukrainians and the Mennonites and the Icelanders and all the rest, newly confederated Canada encouraged European immigration to the West to continue the displacement and disempowerment of the not sufficiently subdued Indigenous peoples. Never mind that the most ardent racists then and now do not consider European Jews to be white. We were white enough to be useful. Thinking all this over, some of us may ask ourselves, if we're settlers here, should we go back where we came from? And then we answer ourselves, oops, we already tried that, thinking of Israel. And then we think that if the world seems to think of us as settler colonizers, not only in the West Bank, but throughout the state of Israel itself, which to Israeli Jews and many Canadian Jews is a homeland that we returned to, then where in the world is there a place for us? Some of us who feel this way have embraced the notion of indigeneity and applied it to ourselves as an indigenous people of the Middle East. And in this, we find indigenous allies. Many indigenous people in Manitoba are Christian, a growing number, Pentecostal Christians, and therefore see us Jews as God's chosen people. They are happy to accept offers from Jewish organizations of trips to Israel. They are happy to support our claim of indigeneity there. Others of us Winnipeg Jews reject that whole line of thought, see ourselves as a people without a homeland, accept the label of settlers, and perhaps participate in agitation for Palestinian liberation alongside Indigenous activists who support that cause. So, regardless of our political views, we seem to seek alliance with Indigenous people. And that is because we as Jews can see ourselves reflected in their stories and their struggles. All of the following can be said of Jews and Indigenous people alike. We have older traditions than those around us. We have our own laws and have governed ourselves when we could. We have seen our sacred objects taken away by persecutors. We are survivors of genocide. We are oral cultures, big talkers. We have ancestral languages that we wish to keep alive. We like to laugh in spite of everything at the world and at ourselves. From time to time, I attempt to study Cree, the most widely spoken and vital Indigenous language in this part of the world. In the most recent class I joined, I found dialect differences causing difficulty. The textbook was in Plains Cree, but the teacher spoke Swampy Cree. Beyond that, the participants in the class, who came from Cree-speaking families, each spoke somewhat differently. It seemed that even from one family to another, pronunciation, vocabulary, and idioms varied, making it difficult to find common ground. Meanwhile, my wife, Jane Enkin, has been working on improving her ancestral language, Yiddish. The same difficulties have been coming up in the class she's been taking. The textbook is in a standardized Yiddish that is no one's actual speech. The teacher has one home dialect. The people in the class who grew up with some Yiddish each speak it differently. So within that class too, It's been hard to find common ground. But I see in these experiences common ground between our peoples as we struggle to keep our languages alive. And so do some of the indigenous people I know. How all of this can tie together, how to wrap it all up, how to find a good conclusion, that is still being worked out. And so I really cannot tell you. But we heard earlier that Lee Miracle said that she wrote in her powerful indigenous voice for the readers who will say, okay, I can do something about that. That initial response really is where I and my community find ourselves today as we hear Indigenous voices, Indigenous stories ever more clearly. Thank you so much. Tonopah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin. This was an extremely thought provoking and very emotional presentation that you shared with all of us. Um, I have a query. Would you like to stay on for the rest of the session? Because I believe it's pretty late at your end. Or we could
It
have,
is late, but I would like to stay on, however.
okay, in that case, we'll have the questions at the end of the session after the second presentation. Okay, so we move on to Nishant now. The title of Nishant's paper is Indian Diaspora on Stolen Lands, Colonial Relationalities and Other Solidarities. Over to you, Nishant.
Thank you so much. I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share, and if you can let me know if it's everyone can see it.
Sure.
Wait, let me open the PowerPoint on my side first, on the presentation mode.
We did just see it before.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
I'm not sure why it's not scrolling down. Let me try this again. If not, then I'll just present without it. Okay, so somehow this is not, I'm not able to scroll down through the slides. If I
Can
I
you
just
mail it
email
to
and
us?
yeah, I'll do that so that it'll
Okay.
be, because there's a lot of pictures that I wanted to show and quotes.
Okay.
Give me a second. Sorry about this.
Meanwhile, Justin, are you there? Can we take some questions for Justin for
I am here and I'd be
Okay,
happy to
then
take.
we can take some questions for Justin for the next 5 minutes while we put this in order. Dhiman, you have a question, right? Okay.
Things to share, which I wanted to do. Hello, Justin.
Hi, Timan.
Yes, I was fondly recollecting. Is being taken care of? This echo. No, I don't. You have to show me.
I
It's echo. It's echoing.
You've become very quiet.
Yeah, you have to unmute here. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
I'm hearing you now.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. The thing is that I am fondly recollecting Elder Louis Bird had addressed that what happens even when he is very much there in that process of documentation and in the way of transferring anything into English takes away the essence of that storytelling, that language in it. And he was one of those
Yes.
living legends of Omushkigomo Cree storytellings, where he was
Yes.
talking about Vittigo. You remember that he said that if you don't
Oh, yes.
understand them now, it will come back to you later. You have to wait for it. And I think in August, I was in Winnipeg. And by September, October, Lee Maracle's Windigo Tale was being premiered in Toronto, which dealt with
Yes.
the idea of the Vittigo or the Windigo. So for a non-native person like me, uh, trying hard to understand indigenous spirituality, what is the center of this Windigo and Vittigo? And last evening, Kolumpa fondly recollects how her mother's belongings were being burnt. That's the
Yes.
traditional belief of why you should burn things. Now, the thing is that the problem that we often do is that we try to equate that with any kind of cultural marker that we have in our cultures. We do have certain identical cultures, but the essence is so different from indigenous practices. Rather, we might have had actually absorbed certain things from them and not the other way around. There are points of convergences where we tend to make the mistakes of comparing cultures of indigenous and non-indigenous, which you so intelligently avoided, and probably you dealt with the multiple layers of how we can think of an indigenous non-indigenous alliance. Because I remember that was one thing which Lee Miracle continuously was thinking about, ideas of alliances, because we have to accept that we are on uh, indigenous lands, and as non-indigenous person, how human beings, how do we interact with those without being affected or being patronizing their cultures? Because that is probably what one of my students was also trying to say last evening, that we at times we end up patronizing certain cultures, taking away the essence of it. So I really appreciate that. And very interestingly, you had mentioned that 19th February, when we were doing this memorial service for Lee Miracle, you are also remembering Louis Riel. 19th
Yes.
February. And I remember Professor Warren Carew and our mentor Renata. So you know that these were instrumental people, people who were instrumental in encouraging Canadian studies in this part of the world. Warren had traveled all the way to join Ganesh Devi's Tejgarh Tribal Academy. And of course, Renata had traveled to India, been an close academic associate of Suchorita Di, and we have a Renata Memorial prize also now at the Jadavpur University. So what I was trying to understand is this indigenous, non-indigenous interface, because Renata often had to deal with this, of how do you talk about indigeneity as a non-indigenous person. The amount of humility that is required, it was clear from your presentation, the humility with which you are approaching that entire subject. So before questions, since I had time, I just wanted to acknowledge that uh, I have made friends on indigenous lands, and people continuously talked about the Red River movement, about Louis Riel, about the Métis
Yes.
people's contribution in the indigenous insurgencies across Canada. And of course, we were celebrating a Métis woman last evening and her ancestry. So that way, I would believe that the idea of this conference it's coming full circle for me, because I'm remembering so many people whom I should have actually invited on board and I missed out. So you can understand that you are actually expanding the idea of the circle, which we were talking about, that in this room, we are actually in that circle. And we have our friend Nishant here, who actually introduced me to Bonita Lawrence at York University, another major force of, I would say, Red Power movement in India. And Nigam is again one of the most vocal young minds, I would say, as far as theory is concerned in the field of indigenous studies. And Nigam also happens to be associated with Daniel Heath Justice, who is a Cherokee, who was my academic supervisor in Toronto. So you can understand how you have managed to expand another circle for me this morning, remembering indigenous people from my location. And that could be possible because we were all there. We were meant to be there. Which Lee mentioned again and again, that there must be some reason why we are here in this circle. And we are continuously expanding this circle. So Justin, so it's my gratitude that I wanted to convey, that you agreed on it and we again expanded that cycle. So if Nishant is ready, then we can go for it and again come back to you with questions.
And thank you so much, and my gratitude to you for making this circle across continents, across oceans. This is very wonderful. Thank you, Dhiman.
Yeah. Over to you, Nishant. Now they will be sharing your slide shortly.
Okay, great. Okay.
We have received it and they will share it. Yes. Over to you.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you. This is thank you, Dhiman, for that note of open the circle and people coming into the circle. I'm really excited to be part of this space. Sorry, I could not attend yesterday because of the time difference. So it's past 10 my time, and so I'm gonna be careful to not just keep rambling.
Nishant, 1 minute.
Yeah.
I'm just interrupting. They need you to send the soft copy of the PPT, not just a
Oh, it didn't
link.
come.
They are unable to open that file from here.
Open it.
So the soft copy
It's
of
okay.
the
I think
PPT.
I can try to do it, send a PDF. That might be easier. Uh, Technical problems. Just give me a second. Uh, it's taking forever for it to be uploaded. Okay, it's right there.
Suchorita, would it be all right if I asked a question of Justin?
Absolutely, Julie. Most welcome. Justin, are you around?
Thank you so much. Justin, that talk of yours was so evocative and it was so personal. It blew us away. Um, I have actually a question for you that is kind of dodgy and takes you onto the geopolitical aspect of things. In the current situation in the Middle East, and I was just wondering, do you sometimes have young scholars in your class, or perhaps people you're supervising, asking you about how you would negotiate the question of Palestine and Israel vis-a-vis, the First Nations people and the settlers? It's a tough one, but it's something that I think I would love to hear you address.
Sorry, I had stepped away for a moment. Was that a question for me?
Yes, Justin.
Okay. So, I mean, of course, I mean,
I was just saying how your very evocative talk blew us away. It was fascinating. And the question I had was really a geopolitical one, which we can't
yes,
get away from, even when we are teaching
right. No,
literature. So would you say?
I heard that part. And yeah, of course, I mean, we can't get away from this question. I touched on, right, two ways that Jewish people here in Canada approach it, right, in terms of the whole question of settler colonialism and whether that applies to Israel, right? There are those who argue that it certainly does apply. It was interesting. My son is very interested in old dictionaries, so at one point we were looking together at an Oxford dictionary from the, I think, early 1900s, and it defined Zionism as the movement to establish Jewish colonies in Palestine. And we realized that at that point there was nothing, that was not a controversial political statement, right? That was simply, a description that anybody would have accepted, that it was about establishing Jewish colonies in Palestine. And from that point of view, the Jewish people who founded the state of Israel came primarily from Europe, where they had been for many centuries, to a land where Palestinians already lived. And so it has, essentially the same deep-seated problems as any other settler colonial state, except that, the violence involved is much worse. On the other hand, there are those who argue, as I mentioned, that you can't talk about settler colonialism in this context. There was no imperial mother country sending its settlers to colonies. The Jewish people have been wandering around the world, oppressed by one colonizing empire after another for millennia, and at last returned to their mother country. And is there a statute of limitations on coming home, right? And so this is why, where, again, as I mentioned, people on both sides of this inner Jewish argument about the validity of Zionism seek and find indigenous allies. So now, as a teacher, I feel that my own kind of political take on this is pretty irrelevant. The Netanyahu is not listening to me. I guarantee Hamas is not listening to me, nor is the Palestinian Authority. I'm working with students here in Winnipeg, some of whom are Palestinian, some of whom are Israeli born, some of whom are Jewish with various views, etc., etc. So, if I'm asked this kind of question, I simply try to explain as clearly as I can some of the different perspectives on this, with a view toward helping people at least have some understanding of each other, right? This is what I get, by the way, from the Talmud, which is a core Jewish text that I teach and study. The Talmud is full of arguments.
Yes.
But its concern is never with who's right. Its concern is always rather to demonstrate that both sides of the argument make sense.
Right.
And that's what I feel as a teacher in the world of Jewish studies is my role, right? So I will in fact be teaching this fall a course titled Zionism, Religious Perspectives. And we will be looking at mainly Jewish, but also some Muslim and some Christian perspectives on all of these questions. And again, I will try to, set out those positions as clearly as I can, and that's my task, I feel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for asking. I appreciate it.
Okay, there's one more question for you, Justin. Uh,
Good morning, sir. My name is Rishti Ray, and I am an MA Mass Comm student from Jamia Millia Islamia. Sir, I just wanted to ask you that as a future media professional and as a non-indigenous person myself, how can we go out and cover indigenous individuals without bringing in stereotyping, without portraying them in the light which governments usually portray them in, as depressed, as people without agency? Because as I think we have understood through the course of this wonderful seminar, is that indigenous people are anything but depressed. They are people with holistic lives. They are happy, with agency, with a rich cultural history. So, sir, how can we change the narrative as future storytellers, filmmakers, journalists, and portray them in that line, sir? Like, what is your perspective on that?
Well, what a wonderful question. Thank you. I mean, first of all, I would agree with you as a general assessment in terms of the, being happy and having, all these riches. I mean, if we look at Indigenous nations within Canada, uh, as a whole, each of those nations has a rich culture, and as we've been learning about their own laws, their own stories, the framework for fulfilling lives, definitely. But on the other hand, we are in a situation in which settler colonialism has, by and large, not worked out well. There has been an ongoing, increasingly recognized in Canada, genocide of Indigenous people here. On the individual level, many Indigenous people are living pretty miserable lives. There's the social problems I mentioned in Winnipeg are very real: homelessness, addiction, lateral violence. This disproportionately affects Indigenous people. So there is that also to consider. But as far as getting beyond the stereotypes, I would say, I would encourage you to do what I am trying to do, which is to listen, right? To meet Indigenous people as individuals, as well as members of their various communities, and to listen what they want to tell you, right? Um, it's very easy, I would think, as a journalist, because I've experienced this myself as an interviewee, to go in with your questions in mind and basically with your answers that you want to get also in mind. I've been in interviews where it's clear that they had a certain outcome in mind and they were going to keep pushing until they got it. So don't do that, right? Go in open, go in, ready to hear what people want to tell you. And again, with awareness of the individuality. One of the other examples of Indigenous creativity with the English language around here is that many people are saying Indigenous peoples, meaning not the various Indigenous nations, but the various individuals. It's felt that the word people, while it's already a plural of person, is not quite plural enough to convey the diversity and the idiosyncrasy and the individualities of Indigenous folks. So Indigenous peoples is becoming used as a way of talking about all those different individuals. And if we're alert to the individuality, as I am when I think about any of the storytellers, for example, that I mentioned, each of them with a strong personality, with a whole different way of looking at things, different approaches to their stories, then I think we will not get bogged down in the stereotypes and we'll be able to learn something. And as a journalist, you'll be able to help other people learn something as well.
Thank you so much, sir. That really answers my question.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Justin.
you for asking.
Over to you, Nishant. Now we are ready with the PPT.
Okay, great. Okay, third time is a charm. So hopefully this will work. So again, thank you so much for having me in the space. It's really nice to be part of these conversations. I was at Jadavpur with you over 10 years ago, I think, on an India-Canada conference. And so it's just good to come back.
12 years back.
Yeah, 12 years back. Okay, so
Yes.
it's been a while. And I met Himan more than 12 years back in Toronto. And so,
Yes.
research interest aligned at that time, and we've continued to be in conversation. So I'm not a literature scholar. I'm a social scientist. I dabble in humanities and literature a little bit. But so a lot of my talk today is going to be from a social science lens. And what I want to do is to talk about two different projects. They're connected that I've been working for the last few years, many years. First is my book, which is on the second slide, Indians on Indian Lands, Intersections of Race, Caste, Indigeneity, which will come out. Something is happening on my screen. Okay, okay. I'll keep talking as the slides get uploaded. So this is a project that this was my doctoral project that I've been working over for the last 10 years, and finally it's coming to an end, where the book looks at what does it mean for Indians from India to be on Indian lands in North America, specifically in the Canadian context. And specifically, I look through the lens of caste, where I'm studying dominant caste Indians in the settler colonial context of Canada. And for this, I did research. This is slide number 3, in different parts of Canada, western and eastern parts, where I did interviews in Vancouver and Surrey, which is in British Columbia, in Fort McMurray, which is in Alberta, and Toronto, which is in Ontario. And Toronto is where I did grad school in. And these different sites I chose for different historical reasons of migration of South Asians. So Vancouver and Surrey, and generally British Columbia was one of the first places that Indians, mostly Sikhs and Punjabis, started coming over a century ago, when under the British Empire. So a lot of these were folks who were moving from British South Asia to British Canada, British North America. And so Vancouver has a very long history of Sikhs and Punjabis settled there, and different kinds of solidarities that they have formed with indigenous communities and other communities of color and racialized communities there. And so in Vancouver, I mostly focused on Punjabis who had moved in the 60s and 70s from Punjab, mostly from Punjab to British Columbia, who mostly moved to do working class jobs like working in the sawmills or fish canneries. Men worked in the sawmills and women worked in canneries. And they were all across North and South British Columbia, and also Vancouver Island, which is where the capital of Vancouver, Victoria is. Capital of British Columbia, Victoria is. And I spoke to them around 2013 to 2015. And so these were people who had come in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and were mostly retired at this by the time I spoke to them, to talk about what did it mean for them to move from Punjab to India, to Canada, I mean, and what kind of relations, intimacies, proximities, and encounters that they have with indigenous folks in these rural sites of work. Sawmills and fish canneries were mostly rural industries. And I juxtaposed that with Fort McMurray, which is the site of tar sands or oil sands, where Canada's largest oil is, and one of the largest oil banks in the world. But it's unlike oil found in many other parts of the world. It's really mixed with soil and dirt and bitumen, and it's really a tedious process to extract oil, which makes it also very environmentally unsustainable, and has displaced and dispossessed many indigenous communities who were on these lands, but also through the health effects and environmental effects of oil extraction continues to deeply affect indigenous communities, which a lot of indigenous activists in the region call a slow genocide that's happening through oil extraction. And so in this context, I interviewed engineers who had moved from India, who were much more higher skilled, quote unquote, high skilled workers who are working for the extractive industry as engineers to make sure that extraction happens. And so I juxtapose, and these are much more younger people who had moved to Canada or in this area in the last 10 to 20 years, unlike the Punjabis who had moved in the 60s and 70s. And so these are two different extraction sites, sawmills and fisheries in the British Columbia context, and oil sands in Alberta, where I'm looking at what does it mean for people of color, especially Indian diaspora, to be involved in extraction, which is directly connected to dispossession and displacement of indigenous peoples in these communities, in these geographies. And what does it mean for the Canadian state to use labor of color to dispossess, further dispossess, displace, and colonize indigenous people in that, right? So complicities of indigenous Indians in these extraction projects. And then the last site is Toronto, where I did interviews with South Asian activists who are not necessarily Indian, but South Asian across the geographies of South Asia and also across the wide diasporas of South Asians across the globe, who have been working for the last many years in solidarity with indigenous communities, both within the urban context of Toronto, but also the larger context of Turtle Island, who are trying to think of their positionalities and their responsibilities and be accountable to indigenous peoples in a very decolonial way of thinking about what does it mean for communities of color to be here, and what does it mean to be complicit, but also what does it mean to be allies, and what does it mean to resist against the settler state. And so 3 different geographies, 3 different time periods that I look at, and I bring them together to then make a few key arguments, which is on the next slide. I'm not sure if the slides are working. They're not. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I just got lost track. But so I'm making 4 different arguments in the book. First, I'm looking at what does it mean to look at the labor of Indians in these extraction sites, and how in my conversations with both in Vancouver and in Fort McMurray, often people use this idea that we are good workers, we are steady workers, we are hard workers as compared to everyone else, which includes indigenous people and white workers and other communities of color. And so I talk about how these myths of Indians as model minority are really integral to how different Indian communities find themselves in the Canadian state, where the Canadian state is mostly looking for people of color to come there for their labor, to come and work there. And over the years, Canada has shifted more and more towards quote unquote high skilled workers. So engineers, primarily in that category, doctors and other high skilled workers as well. But engineers have been really foundational in the last decade or two that Canada continues to attract. Prior to that, Canada would also attract a lot of working class folks. So that's why a lot of Punjabis were in these working class industries in British Columbia. But across these these industries of sawmills, fishery, fish canneries, and the tar sands, what I noticed was in conversations, often people talking about we work hard and we deserve to be here, and we are Canada wants us, so we are the model minority. We are good workers, hard workers, and steady workers, and invariably constructing themselves as the model workers. Sometimes not so in subtle ways, and sometimes in more direct ways. The comparison was with indigenous people to say they're not model workers. They're lazy workers. They don't work. They don't have work ethics as Indians do, and that's why we deserve to be here, and they're not here, right? And so I try to talk about complicity through the question of labor and the formation of model minorities, to rupture this idea that Indians are not just a people of color, but they become complicit. So they might face different forms of racism and face different kinds of structural oppression due to white supremacy within the Canadian context, yet they can also partake in settler colonial processes, where many of them I would actually call settlers, because they've not been part of the historical settler colonial project of Canada, but the contemporary formation of the settler colonial project. Many become really righteous participants within of the settler colonial project, where instead of making solidarities with indigenous communities and other communities of color, they rather align themselves with the white Canadian settler project to then say that we deserve to be here. Right. And so those questions of moral minority I trace through conversations where sometimes they would directly say that indigenous people are lazy, they're prone to addiction to alcohol and drug substance abuses, they're prone to not working, they're prone to not be quote unquote cultured enough to be in a cosmopolitan working environment. And so deeply racist and blatantly racist conversations that would just come out when I was engaging with them. But I also note that there's a difference between British Columbia and Alberta, the Indians I spoke to in these contexts, because class makes a very different, the analytics of class is really important to look at along with race. That Punjabis in British Columbia, who are mostly in rural parts of British Columbia, also would often say that this is indigenous land, this is Indian land, and we are here, but we are on someone else's land. They would at least discursively say that, and I argue that it doesn't translate so much into material solidarities, but it's still a really important discursive way of showing solidarity. Whereas for the engineers in the tar sands, every time I ask them, so what is your relationship with indigenous people? Have you seen them? Do you interact with them? Do you work with them? And they would either say, I've never seen them, which is really hard in a city like Fort McMurray, because it's basically the Wild West frontier land where indigenous people are there, and is surrounded, Fort McMurray is surrounded by many reservations. And so they were either blatantly deny that, or then say that they are alcoholics, they are addicts, they're lazy, and they just take free money from the state, right? And so I say, I'm arguing that those are Indians who are much more upwardly mobile and high skilled and highly paid are actually much more closer to their white counterparts in claiming a settlerness to the Canadian state and using anti-Indigenous discourses that the Canadian state produces, whereas working class Punjabis had a very different understanding. Even though they're complicit in settler colonial processes, they had a much more intimate understanding of what it means to be on someone else's land, a land that is not Canadian but Indigenous, and that they become part of the Canadian structure because of through their labor and citizenship, but they rather be in alliance with Indigenous communities. The second point that I'm trying to make in the book is to talk about caste. Caste is something that is not really discussed within South Asian and Indian diaspora studies, about who is in the diaspora, how people come here, what their caste backgrounds are, and how does different caste communities engage within the Canadian and the American state structures. And so, as I said, everyone I interviewed were dominant caste. In BC, they were all Jats, which is a dominant caste community. And in Fort McMurray, there were Indians from all across the subcontinent, but they were also all dominant caste. Majority of them were Brahmins, and then the others were dominant caste as well. And so through the experiences of, and in Fort McMurray, they were also all Hindus, unlike in British Columbia, they were mostly Sikh, or they were all Sikhs. And so I argue that dominant caste Hindus who are highly skilled, highly educated, and upwardly mobile use their understandings of what indigeneity within the Indian context is. So ideas about who Adivasi is, who tribal is, and who also Dalit is, that they use that language to then talk about indigenous people in the Canadian context, right? Because the language that they have access to is to understanding Adivasis and indigenous communities in India, to then they create this homogeneous monolithic idea that indigenous people across Canada and India and globally are similar. And what they talk about in the similarities is the ideas of they're backward, they're not civilized enough, and they're not modern enough. And so in these conversations, when I would talk to them about their understanding of what indigenous struggles in Fort McMurray and Alberta are, they would invariably say they're like Adivasis back home in India. They're like tribal people back home in India, and then invariably also position themselves as superior, that we are much better than Adivasi or indigenous peoples because we are educated, we have high paying jobs, we can speak in English, we can be in this part of the world, whereas indigenous peoples, quote unquote, are stuck in backward times, right? And so caste, one of the primary ways that caste then plays into these conversations was through ideas of who is backward within the Indian context, and backward within the Indian, quote unquote, backward in the Indian context is a conflation of not just Adivasi, tribal, indigenous communities, but also often using the terminology of backward communities that the Constitution and the Indian state follows to also include Dalit and Bahujan communities. And so that was the other idea that comes up in relationship to caste was about reservations. To say, as a lot of you might be familiar with this idea, that dominant caste and Brahmins and dominant caste Indians move out of India saying they can't get jobs or education opportunities in India because of the reservation system. That's why we are leaving, right? And so this blatantly anti-reservation attitudes that a lot of caste privileged Indians have, they brought up those ideas to say that I left India because I was not able to get a job because other communities are taking over my jobs, and I'm so skilled and I have merit, and my merit and my skills are not being recognized, so I'm going to move to a country like Canada, where quote unquote there are no racial reservation or positive affirmation policies. But once they come to Canada, they encounter some forms of positive affirmation policies for Indigenous people, which are not as institutionalized as in the case of reservations in the Indian context, but there's some policies that the state tries to give to recognize the historical oppression of indigenous communities, to give them access to education, at least, if not jobs. And so often, a lot of times in these conversations in Fort McMurray, people would say, I left India because of the reservation system, and now I'm here and I see indigenous people getting reservations. And then position themselves as victims of reservation systems across these countries to say, I'm skilled, I'm educated, I'm qualified, and I'm here because of merit, but both the Canadian state and the Indian state is not recognizing my skills and my merit and my qualifications, right? And so then there's going to anti-reservation, which would become anti-Adivasi, anti-Indigenous, anti-Dalit rhetorics and discourses, and basically racism. And so I try to unpack these conversations to say that settler colonialism on surface does not have much to do with Brahminism or Brahminical supremacy, but within the Indian diasporic context, Brahminical supremacy ideas and white settler colonial ideas within the Canadian context intersect, because what dominant caste communities bring with them from the Indian context to Canada, and then how they relate to Indigenous people, and also to Black communities, that they're superior than both Indigenous and Black communities, as they're superior to Indigenous, Adivasi, Dalit, Bahujan communities in the Indian context as well. Right, and so I'm just quickly going through all these things, and I'll be happy to take more questions. The third point about colonial intimacies is where I put a humanities hat or a literature person hat, which I'm not really trained in literature, but I look at two short stories, one by Thompson Highway, whose name has been mentioned today, and I saw in the program, folks have been talking about him, who's a Cree playwright and author, and he has this beautiful story called The Lover Snake, which is a queer story of intimacy between Indigenous man and a Sikh man. And I juxtaposed that story with a Punjabi writer, Sadhu Binning, who has the story about a Punjabi man marrying an Indigenous woman. Both are set in Vancouver in the 70s and 80s, so similar time period that I was looking at Punjabi communities. And both stories offer us insights into how Indian and Indigenous people may have come together to form form different kinds of sexual, romantic intimacies with each other. And through literature, these accounts are only available through stories and not so much in the archives or oral histories or academic scholarship. So I argue that rather than calling them interracial intimacies, colonial intimacies is a much better framework to understand how within the settler colonial context, indigenous peoples may form intimacies with other racialized peoples, non-white people. And how it's the settler colonial state that allows for these people to come together, but also is scared of different racialized and colonized communities to come together, and that's why it has been invested in something like the anti-miscegenation laws in the US context, or the Indian Act in the Canadian context, where indigenous women lost they married a non-indigenous man, were all these ways of trying to prohibit communities of color and indigenous communities to come together and form intimacies. And so colonial intimacies is a really, for me, is an indigenous woman loses her indigenous status. And once he gets Canadian citizenship, he abandons her. And that abandonment is the logic of the settler state, where indigenous women and contemporary within the Canadian state have been marginalized, murdered and missing indigenous women that Justin talked about, violences that indigenous women, two-spirit, queer, and indigenous girls face, the story of Sadhu Bedi. And so colonial settler state challenged the capitalist white supremacist logics of the settler state, and communities can come together to form anti-colonial solidarities, but also can reproduce the logics of the settler state, reproduce white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism as well. And then I close the book with talking about other solidarities, which is where I go back to the interviews in Toronto, where people are imagining other forms to be, how to be a person of color, how to be South Asian in the Canadian context, and form ethical, relational solidarities with indigenous people, which is challenging the settler state, challenging anti-indigenous racism within South Asian communities, and trying to imagine a future which is different than what the current reality for indigenous people and communities of color is in Canada. And so that was the book project. I'll maybe, in lieu of time, just quickly take maybe 5 minutes to talk about a new across Canada, US, and other Western European countries and white settler states like Australia and New Zealand have become really, really, really prominent in the last few years. And so as we witness escalation of Hindu nationalism and fascism within the Indian context, we are also seeing how that is being shaped by players in the diaspora, right? In the US context, both within the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, Hindu nationalists have been gaining a lot more legitimacy, and they're going up the ranks. So Vivek Ramaswamy has connections with Hindu nationalism, and in the Democrat Party, we've seen in the last election, there were candidates who were connected to Hindu nationalist organizing, and that Hindu nationalists are getting a lot more prominence and recognition across the political spectrum. And one of the strategies that they've started relying more recently is to then say we are also indigenous, right? And so the next slide, Govalkar, who was one of the ideologues of Hindutva ideologies in colonial times, him and Savarkar and others started saying that Hindus are indigenous to South Asia and Muslims and Christians are not indigenous to South Asia, denying Adivasi, tribal, and indigenous claims of communities across India, also Dravidian understanding of indigeneity, also Dalit understanding of indigeneity, and imposing an Aryan, saying Aryans are basically, the Aryan Dravidian conversation is obviously, as many of you know, is much more complicated, so I'm not going to get into that, but this idea that Hindus are indigenous erases indigeneity of Adivasi indigenous. Hindu right in India has been using this this framework more and more intensely in the last over the last decade. In the diaspora, the next slide, Hindu activists, Hindu nationalists have also started using this discourse of indigeneity, and so are saying Suchorita, whose tweet I have here, is the executive director of this fascist group called Hindu American Foundation, which has been at the forefront of spreading Hindu nationalist agendas within the political realm, the legal, and caste apartheid as Hindu-phobic, which they're relying from Zionist framing of anti-Semitism, that any critique of Israel or any critique of Zionism becomes anti-Semitic. Hindu nationalists are saying any critiques of Hinduism or any critiques of Hindutva and any critiques of the Indian state and any critique from Modi invariably become Hindu-phobic, right? And so as they're mobilizing this discourse of Hindu-phobia, which is fake, because Hindu-phobia is not any form of structural institutionalized form of racism against Hindus within India or within North America. There might be other communities where there might be anti-Hindu sentiments, but within North America, it's not institutionalized in any way that other communities of color face. So I think Hindu-phobia is a fictional narrative that draws from the fictional narratives of anti-Semitism in relationship to critiques of Israel and Zionism, not about anti-Semitism, which obviously Jewish people still face. And Whisperers that won an Oscar last year, which talks about Adivasi communities, and so Sohag Shukla is then Hinduizing justice and anti-indigenous, to paralleling that to the Kashmiri Pandits and claiming they're also indigenous to the valley. Right? And so this claim that only Hindus are indigenous and Muslims are not deeply Brahminical, but deeply also tells us about the colonial project of Brahmanism and Hindutva. Colonial project of Brahmanism and Hindutva. And so I'm just laying the map out of how indigeneity is invoked by Hindutva to then share these examples, which are in the next few slides. The next slide is some of you might have been familiar with the Dakota Access Pipelines protests that happened in the Dakota. That's why Hindus should stand in solidarity with indigenous people, without talking about caste, without Hawaii in relation to the 30-meter telescope protests that have been happening in Hawaii for the last 5-6 years, more than 5-6 years. Greenwashing Hinduism and what is happening now with resources, minerals, water, land from them, right? And so and that in a Brahminical state like India, Hindus are then a few more examples from further ahead and saying that abortion are long distant cousins, and we have similar cultural practices. Say the fire ceremony is similar, and that's why we are automatically in solidarity with these. What all these conversations are erasing is conversations of complicity of Hindu diaspora in colonization of indigenous communities in apartheid and Brahmanism, where Hindu dominant caste Hindus are perpetrators of caste violence and Hindu nationalist violence within the Indian context, that they can erase that in the North American or Australian context to say we are in solidarity with indigenous people, which is similar to how some Hindu groups have also come out in solidarity with Black Lives Matter in the last few years, especially in the wake of George Floyd's killing in 2020, which is the next slide. Again, Hindu American Foundation made these claims that we are in solidarity without talking about histories of anti-blackness within India, and also of caste apartheid, and actually parallels between Dalit and Black liberation struggles, where dominant caste Hindus cannot really just be in solidarity with Black folks without accounting for the violences that the Dalit communities face in India and the diasporic context. So I'm gonna switch the last slide to end on a happier note, quote unquote happier note. Against these Hindu nationalist claims to solidarity, South Asians across Canada and US have been in solidarities, which the next slide over, I'm gonna skip this one. So the next slide is South Asians' responses to Idle No More movement. Idle No More movement was, and some of you again might have heard of it, was a really amazing resurgence of indigenous activism to ask Canada for accountability and responsibility of the violences of the settler colonial state. And many South Asian communities came in solidarity with indigenous peoples that time. So there were Tibetans and Tamil folks from Sri Lanka talking about their own genocide and displacement by the Chinese state and the Sri Lankan state, and how they're on Canadian soils, that they have to be in solidarity with indigenous people to recognize the continuities between the settler colonial project of Tibet, of their experiences of colonization and violence and oppression under the British Empire, but also the Indian state, to say that these are histories of colonization and oppression in these different communities, and that's why people need to come out and stand in solidarity with South Asian, with indigenous people. And these solidarities, I argue, are a lot more decolonial with indigenous people, and again, that the Indian states being in cahoots with the Canadian and US settler states, and also the Zionist settler state, that these are indigenous liberation on Turtle Island to Palestinian liberation and Kashmiri liberation are deeply interconnected struggles. And then the last image of the farmers' protest, which are, as we are witnessing them happening again, and state repression of these protests in the last week. But going back to the protests in 2020 and 2021, many people in the Punjabi, specifically the Punjabi diaspora in North America, started seeing what was happening to Punjabi diaspora in North America, seeing what was happening to Punjabi Sikh farmers in Punjab, and the way the Indian state was attacking farmer protests in Haryana and Delhi, to talk about land displacement and the value of land within Punjabi communities and indigenous communities, and making these connections of neoliberal agendas of dispossession within Turtle Island context to the neoliberal agendas of regulating farming and agriculture in the Indian context, which would then dispossess peasant and farming communities a lot more for then companies like Monsanto and others to make profit, right? And so these are many different instances that in the last few years we have witnessed different South Asian communities coming in solidarity, understanding their own struggles of colonization, oppression, displacement, dispossession, and connecting it with indigenous people. And to just wrap up, they just offer a lot more decolonial understanding of what the future should look like, unlike Hindu nationalists, which we know the future for them, what they think about India, what their agendas are in India, and those agendas are not cannot be in any way seen as progressive within South Asia. Well, I hope not, but in probably for the next 5 years as well, right? Turtle Island to Kashmir to Palestine are interconnected struggles, and I think we can learn a lot more about connecting these struggles rather than what Hindu nationalists want to offer us. So I will end there. So thank you so much. Thank you for navigating the slides for me. In presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Sir Nishant. I'm Sakshi, an assistant professor in English from Goa. I had a query. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, firstly. You mentioned that we as Indians are considered better than the indigenous, but you also mentioned that we tend to become victims of discrimination, capitalism, racism. So, what do you think the degree or extent to which we as Indians are discriminated, and what is the current status of Indian immigrants in Canada in particular?
Questions of racism, right, as they face. I think there's some different layers to it, right? So racism that I have followed coming to Canada, who are not getting housing, not getting proper job opportunities, and are being seen as a ruckus by a lot of white Canadians that Indian students are taking over, right? And so there's obviously racism there, a lot of racism there. But that racism is, I think, racism is helpful to understand within an institutional way of who is at the lowest hierarchies of white supremacy. So we see indigenous and black communities in the Canadian context, whose histories of settler colonialism, histories of genocide, histories of anti-blackness, and histories of enslavement in the Canadian context, that black and indigenous communities are at the far bottom rung then to align themselves with indigenous and black communities, right? And so especially the more educated, the most qualified, the more skilled, again in quotes, people are, the more they want to distance themselves from other communities, marginalized communities, right? And so in that way,